Fate forced Prince Paul of Yugoslavia to face a choice from Adolf Hitler: sign a deal with the devil, or lead his nation to its destruction. His pragmatic decision to save his people got him branded a traitor, overthrown in a coup, and triggered a devastating Nazi invasion. This is the story of a man who tried to prevent a war, only to be remembered by history as the one who started it. To understand the impossible tightrope Paul was forced to walk, you must first understand the ground beneath his feet. The country he would one day rule, Yugoslavia, was not a nation forged in the mists of time. It was a political experiment, a state of emergency given a name, bolted together in 1918 from the smoldering wreckage of fallen empires. The name itself, Yugoslavia, land of the South Slavs, was a beautiful romantic dream. The reality was far more complex, a shotgun marriage of peoples bound by similar languages, but bitterly divided by centuries of different histories, religions, and alphabets. It was a kingdom of cracks, held together by hope and increasingly by force. At its heart were the Serbs. As Orthodox Christians who wrote in the Cyrillic script, they saw themselves as the rightful leaders of this new state. They had fought and bled for its creation, suffering unimaginable losses in the First World War. At least a quarter of their population had perished. For them, Yugoslavia was an extension of Serbia, a reward for their sacrifice. Their king was now the king of all South Slavs, and their capital, Belgrade, was the nation's capital. They were the dominant pillar of the army, the government, and the civil service. Then there were the Croats, fiercely Catholic and using the Latin alphabet. They had spent 800 years under Hungarian and Austrian rule. They had a long history of their own statehood and a deep-seated suspicion of centralized power, especially power wielded from Belgrade. While many Croats had initially embraced the idea of a unified South Slav state as an escape from Germanic domination, they quickly came to resent what they perceived as Serbian hegemony. They saw it as merely swapping a master in Vienna for one in Belgrade. Their desire for autonomy, for recognition of their distinct national identity, would become the single most explosive issue in Yugoslav politics. And there were the Slovenes, also Catholic and Latin alphabet users, geographically and culturally closest to Austria and Italy. Smaller in number and more pragmatic, they were often caught in the middle of the Serb-Croat struggle, trying to preserve their own language and culture while navigating the treacherous political currents. Into this volatile mix, add the Bosnian Muslims, remnants of the Ottoman era, seeking their place in a Christian-dominated kingdom. Add Macedonians whose very identity was disputed by Serbia, Bulgaria, and Greece. Add significant Hungarian and German minorities in the north, and Albanian populations in the south. This was not a melting pot. It was a pressure cooker, and the lid was being held down by a dynasty of soldiers. That dynasty was the Serbian House of Karađorđević, led by King Alexander I. A man forged in the brutal crucible of the Balkan Wars and the Great War. Alexander was no diplomat. He was a stern, unyielding soldier who had seen his country nearly wiped from the map. He believed, perhaps with good reason, that the only way to hold this fractured, quarrelsome state together was with an iron fist. He saw the endless bickering of politicians and the rising tide of ethnic nationalism as existential threats. In 1929, following the assassination of a leading Croatian politician on the floor of the parliament itself, Alexander lost all patience. He suspended the constitution, dissolved all political parties, and declared a royal dictatorship. He officially renamed the Kingdom of Serbs, Croats, and Slovenes to the Kingdom of Yugoslavia, a symbolic move to force a single, unified identity upon his people. He redrew internal borders to break up the old historic regions, hoping to erase tribal loyalties. But you cannot erase history with a pen. His actions only drove the divisions deeper underground, where they festered and turned violent. In exile, funded and sheltered by Mussolini's Italy and revanchist Hungary, radical Croatian nationalist groups like the Ustaše, led by the fanatical Ante Pavelić, began plotting the king's overthrow, dreaming of a racially pure, independent Croatia, and seeing assassination as a legitimate political tool. This was the kingdom Prince Paul was born to inherit, not as its king, but as its custodian. He was born in St. Petersburg in 1893, a world away from the raw, violent politics of the Balkans. He was the only son of Prince Arsen Karađorđević, a younger brother of King Peter I of Serbia. His mother was the beautiful and wealthy Russian noblewoman, Princess Aurora of San Donato of the Demidov family. He was never supposed to be in the direct line of succession. His destiny, it seemed, was to be a minor European royal, a footnote to the main story, free to live a life of culture, travel, and quiet, immense privilege. It was a life for which he was perfectly, exquisitely suited. Tragedy struck early. His mother, Aurora, died when he was just a boy, leaving him emotionally adrift. His father, Prince Arsène, was a restless character, a professional soldier who had served in the French Foreign Legion and the Russian cavalry, a man of action who was a virtual stranger to his own sensitive, bookish son. Paul was effectively an orphan, passed into the care of his uncle, King Peter I, in Belgrade. He grew up in the Serbian court, a lonely, introspective, and intellectually curious child, always more comfortable in the royal library than on the parade ground. He was an anomaly, a prince who disliked the sound of trumpets and the sight of uniforms. He found his true home, his spiritual and intellectual anchor, not in the turbulent Balkans, but hundreds of miles away, in the serene, gray stone quads and hallowed halls of the University of Oxford. At Christ Church, Oxford, from 1913, Paul finally blossomed. Here, his intellect was celebrated. His quiet nature was seen not as weakness, but as refinement, and his passion for the arts found fertile ground. He studied fine arts and modern history, and he moved in the most elite aristocratic circles. It was here that he forged the two most important friendships of his life. One was with Prince George, the fourth son of King George V, who would later become the dashing and popular Duke of Kent. The other was with Henry Chips Channon, a fantastically wealthy, witty, and snobbish American-born socialite, who would later become a British member of Parliament, and most importantly for history, a prolific diarist. In the company of these men, and within the insular Anglo-centric world of the British upper class, Paul cultivated the persona that would define him for the rest of his life, the impeccable Anglophile. He spoke flawless, accentless English, dressed like a Savile Row regular, and developed a deep, abiding love for English customs, English understatement, and the English way of life. He adored the gentle beauty of the English countryside, the intellectual rigor of its universities, and the glamour of London society. This was more than just an affectation. It was the core of his identity. He saw himself as a European first, a man of taste and cosmopolitan culture whose values were those of London and Paris, not Belgrade. The fierce, passionate, and often brutal politics of his Balkan homeland felt increasingly alien to him, a problem to be managed rather than a cause to be embraced. He was a man who believed in reason, in diplomacy, in the quiet back-channel conversations that solved problems before they exploded. He believed in compromise, a quality that was in dangerously short supply back home. His immersion in British high society was cemented in 1923 when he married the stunningly beautiful Princess Olga of Greece and Denmark. It was, by all accounts, a genuine and enduring love match. Olga was European royalty of the highest order. Her father was a Greek prince, her mother a Russian Grand Duchess. She was a niece of the King of Greece, a cousin of the future King Paul of Greece, and her sister, the glamorous Princess Marina, would go on to marry Paul's best friend, Prince George, the Duke of Kent. This marriage didn't just give Paul a loving partner, it made him family to the British royal family. He and George VI, the future King of England, would become cousins by marriage. For the next decade, Paul and Olga lived a life that was the very picture of aristocratic bliss. They divided their time between a magnificent palace in Belgrade, a villa in the Slovenian Alps that reminded them of Scotland, and their favorite haunts in London, Paris, and Florence. They had 3 children, Alexander, Nicola, and Elizabeth, and dedicated themselves to their shared passion, assembling one of the finest private art collections in Europe. This was not the hobby of a dilettante. Paul was a serious, knowledgeable connoisseur. With his immense personal fortune, inherited from his mother, he traveled the continent, attending auctions and visiting dealers, acquiring masterpieces with a discerning eye. He bought works by El Greco, Rubens, Renoir, Degas, and Monet. He had a particular love for the Italian Renaissance. But his collection was not for his own private enjoyment. He had a grand vision to build a magnificent museum of modern art in Belgrade. It was to be his great gift to his people, a beacon of Western culture in the Balkans, an institution that would, he hoped, elevate and civilize the public taste. He was, in essence, trying to bring the values of Oxford to the banks of the Danube. He was a man living his dream, a life of beauty, order, and quiet purpose. But in the autumn of 1934, that dream, his meticulously constructed world, and the fragile peace of his nation would all be shattered by the sound of gunfire in a sun-drenched street in Marseille. On October 9th, 1934, King Alexander arrived in France for a state visit intended to strengthen the alliance against the rising threat of fascist Italy and Nazi Germany. He was the linchpin of the Little Entente, an alliance between Yugoslavia, Czechoslovakia, and Romania, backed by France, designed to contain German and Hungarian ambitions. His visit was a major geopolitical event, but security was shockingly lax. The king and the French foreign minister traveled from the port in an open-topped, slow-moving Delage motor car with only a single slow-moving police officer on horseback as an escort. The crowds were cheering, but hidden among them was a man named Vlado Chernozemski. He was a hardened killer, a Bulgarian revolutionary working for the Croatian Ustaše, armed and trained in camps in Italy. As the car moved slowly down the street, Chernozemski darted from the crowd, leaped onto the car's running board, and, shouting, "Long live the king," fired a machine pistol point blank into the vehicle. King Alexander was hit multiple times and died within minutes. The French foreign minister was also mortally wounded. The assassin was cut down by a police saber and then beaten to death by the enraged crowd. The entire horrific event was captured on film by a newsreel cameraman, the first assassination of a head of state to be recorded in such graphic detail. The news spread across Europe like a shockwave. The Iron King was dead, and his heir, his son Peter, was an 11-year-old schoolboy away at prep school in England. According to the terms of Alexander's will, a regency council of 3 was to rule until the boy king came of age in 18 years, and at its head as its dominant figure was to be his cousin Prince Paul. He was at his home in Belgrade when he heard the news. His wife Olga later recalled his reaction with chilling clarity. He was preparing to travel to a hunting party. A telephone call came. He listened, his face draining of all color. He put the phone down, turned to his wife, and uttered 2 words that would define the rest of his life. "I'm lost." He was not being dramatic. He knew in that single terrible instant that the life he had so carefully constructed, the life of art, books, and family, was over. He was being dragged from his private paradise and thrust into the heart of the Balkan inferno. The world of civilized conversation was gone, replaced by a world of political intrigue, ethnic hatred, nationalist fanaticism, and a looming international crisis that threatened to swallow Europe whole. He was horrified. He did not want this power. He felt utterly unqualified for it. In a letter to his friend Chips Channon, he wrote of his despair, "You cannot imagine how I feel. I feel so depressed, so miserable. I never thought that this terrible thing would happen, that I would be called to this terrible position." He saw it not as an opportunity, but as a prison sentence. He was being asked to steer a ship of state through a hurricane, a ship he knew was riddled with leaks and on the verge of breaking apart. The shy intellectual art collector was now the de facto ruler of the most unstable country in Europe. And Europe itself was darkening. To the west, Hitler was methodically dismantling the Treaty of Versailles and rearming Germany. To the east, Stalin was consolidating his terrifying power through show trials and purges. And right on Yugoslavia's borders, Mussolini's Italy, the very nation that had sponsored his cousin's murderers, was expanding its influence and making no secret of its desire to dominate the Adriatic coast. Paul's task was not just difficult, it was, by any rational measure, impossible. A crown of thorns had been thrust upon the one man in the kingdom who had never desired it. For Prince Paul, the regency was not an opportunity, but a prison sentence. The gunshots in Marseille had not only ended a king's life, they had shattered the private, cultured world Paul had so carefully built, thrusting him from the quiet solitude of his art gallery into the center of a political inferno. Crucially, the assassination had not united the country. Instead, it ripped the scab off its deepest wounds. While Serbia burned with a furious desire for vengeance against the nations that had harbored the killers, the mood in Croatia was disturbingly different. In some quarters there was quiet, and in others, open celebration at the death of a dictator. This seething internal hatred was only one of the existential threats Paul now faced. The other was the rising tide of fascism in Germany and Italy, poised to engulf the nation from without. His tenure as regent would be a long, desperate battle on both fronts, a 7-year struggle to hold back a deluge with nothing but reason and diplomacy. This was the political landscape Prince Paul inherited, a Serbian population demanding a strong hand and a Croatian population that would no longer tolerate one. Into this cauldron of hatred stepped a man who despised extremism, a man whose entire being was geared towards calm, rational negotiation. His very nature was at odds with the country he was now forced to lead. His first moves were cautious, designed to lower the political temperature. He eased the press censorship that Alexander had imposed. He released some political prisoners, including the leader of the Croatian Peasant Party, Vladko Maček, who had been jailed by the previous regime. These were gestures of goodwill, an olive branch from a man who wanted to replace Alexander's iron fist with a more considered diplomatic touch. But in the Balkans of the 1930s, such gestures were often misinterpreted as weakness. The Serbian establishment, the powerful military generals, the Orthodox Church hierarchy, the veteran politicians who had built their careers on a platform of unyielding Serbian strength. Watch their new regent with deep suspicion. They saw his Oxford education, his English manners, his passion for foreign art. And they did not see a Serbian prince. They saw a cosmopolitan, a dilettante, a man who was perhaps not entirely one of them. And in a country where identity was everything, this was a dangerous perception. Paul, for his part, felt utterly isolated. He was surrounded by his cousin's men, ministers and generals, who believed in a centralized, Serb-dominated state. He found their rigid nationalism stifling. He confided to his diary and his friends that he found the political atmosphere in Belgrade to be suffocating, provincial, and brutish. He sought refuge in his family and in the construction of his White Palace, a residence he filled with the art he loved, creating an oasis of European refinement in a capital city he often found coarse. His relationship with his co-regents was symbolic of his predicament. The Council of Three had been Alexander's idea, but it was a sham. The other two members, Radenko Stankovic, a Croatian physician, and Ivo Perovic, a Slovene bureaucrat, were men of little political weight. They deferred to Paul on almost all matters. The full, crushing burden of leadership fell on his shoulders alone. He was the sole arbiter, the final authority. It was a loneliness and a responsibility that he would later describe as a form of moral torture. There were two Prince Pauls. There was the public regent, a stiff, formal figure in military uniform, reviewing troops and attending solemn state functions, his face a mask of weary duty. And there was the private man who lived for his trips to London, for weekends at English country estates, for quiet evenings discussing art and literature. This was not just a preference. It was his escape, his lifeline to a world where he felt he truly belonged. His closest confidant was his wife, Princess Olga. She understood the profound cultural dislocation he felt. Her own background was a tapestry of European royalty, and she shared his cosmopolitan outlook. But even she could not fully grasp the unique pressures he was under. He was a Karađorđević, and the name carried with it a heavy, bloody history of struggle and sacrifice that he, the man of culture, had never personally experienced. His foreign policy was a direct reflection of this internal division. His heart, his instincts, and his entire political philosophy pulled him towards the Western democracies. He saw Britain and France as the guarantors of European civilization. He made a spectacular state visit to London in 1935, staying at Buckingham Palace, strengthening his family ties with the British royals. He genuinely believed that Yugoslavia's destiny was tied to this alliance. But his head, the cool, rational part of his mind, could read a map, and the map told a terrifying story. Yugoslavia was geographically isolated from its Western allies. It was bordered by nations that were either openly hostile or falling rapidly under the influence of the new aggressive powers of Germany and Italy. Mussolini's Italy was a constant threat, seeking to expand its control in the Adriatic and openly supporting Croatian separatists. Hungary dreamed of reclaiming territories lost after World War I. Bulgaria had claims on Macedonia, and then there was Germany. Initially, Hitler's rise was a distant rumble, but in March 1936, German troops marched into the demilitarized Rhineland, a blatant violation of international treaties. Britain and France did nothing. For Paul, this was a profoundly disturbing signal. It was the first sign that the Western powers, for all their talk, might not have the will to stand up to Hitler. 2 years later, in March 1938, his worst fears were realized. German troops marched into Austria. The Anschluss was complete. Suddenly, the mighty German Wehrmacht was right on Yugoslavia's northern border. The psychological impact on Paul and his government was immense. Their strategic situation had gone from difficult to perilous. The pressure from Berlin began to mount. Hermann Göring, Hitler's second-in-command, paid a visit to Belgrade. He came ostensibly to hunt, but the real purpose was to charm and intimidate the Yugoslav leadership, to offer economic partnerships, and to hint at the benefits of aligning with the new order in Europe. Paul was polite but non-committal. He was playing for time, desperately hoping that Britain and France would awaken from their slumber and draw a line in the sand. That line, he hoped, would be drawn over Czechoslovakia, Yugoslavia's partner in the Little Entente. When Hitler began demanding the Sudetenland, a German-speaking region of Czechoslovakia, in the summer of 1938, the world held its breath. This surely would be the moment the West would act. Instead, in September 1938, the British and French prime ministers flew to Munich and handed the territory to Hitler in exchange for a meaningless promise of peace for our time. For Prince Paul, the Munich Agreement was a cataclysm. It was not just the betrayal of an ally, it was the complete collapse of his foreign policy. It proved beyond any doubt that he could not rely on the Western powers for his country's security. The Little Entente was dead. Yugoslavia was alone, surrounded by predators. From that moment on, Paul knew that the policy of collective security was a fantasy. The only policy left was survival. He was no longer trying to align with his friends. He was trying to appease his enemies. While the storm clouds gathered over Europe, Paul was fighting a relentless war of attrition at home. The Croatian question consumed his regency. It was a political quagmire, a Gordian knot of historical grievances, cultural pride, and political ambition. He knew, with an intellectual clarity that few of his Serbian colleagues shared, that the Yugoslav state could not survive in the long term without a fundamental reconciliation between its two largest ethnic groups. Alexander's model of centralized repression had failed. It had only created martyrs and fueled extremism. Paul was determined to find a compromise. The man he had to deal with was Vladko Maček, the leader of the powerful Croatian Peasant Party. Maček was no wild-eyed revolutionary. He was a pragmatic, shrewd lawyer who commanded the overwhelming loyalty of the Croatian people. He did not initially want an independent Croatia. What he wanted was a federalized Yugoslavia, a state in which the Croats would have their own autonomous unit with control over their own internal affairs, from policing and education to taxation. He wanted a partnership of equals, not a relationship of master and servant. For the Serbian political establishment, this was heresy. They had shed their blood to create Yugoslavia, and they saw any move towards federalism as the first step towards the country's disintegration. They viewed Maček's demands as a form of blackmail. For years, the political process was deadlocked. Elections were held, but they were often marred by intimidation and boycotts, solving nothing. The parliament was a talking shop, unable to bridge the fundamental divide. Paul understood that the parliament was useless. If a solution were to be found, it would have to be negotiated in secret, directly between the Regency and the Croats, and then imposed from above. He began a long, patient, and politically risky dialogue with Maček. For a man like Paul, who preferred clear, rational discourse, negotiating with Balkan politicians was an exercise in frustration. The talks would drag on for years, a complex dance of proposals and counter-proposals, of advances and retreats. Every concession Paul considered offering to the Croats was met with furious opposition from the Serbian hardliners in his own government and, most dangerously, in the army. The generals saw the Croats as inherently disloyal, a potential fifth column in any future conflict. They believed that giving them autonomy would be strategic suicide, creating a state within a state that could easily break away or side with an enemy. Paul was walking on a razor's edge. If he gave the Croats too little, they would remain alienated and rebellious. If he gave them too much, he risked a military coup from his own Serbian generals. This internal struggle was his constant companion. He was fighting a two-front war against the external threats from Germany and Italy and against the internal threats of Serbian intransigence and Croatian separatism. And he knew the two were linked. He understood that a divided, strife-torn Yugoslavia was a weak Yugoslavia, an easy target for foreign predators. Hitler and Mussolini were experts at exploiting internal ethnic divisions. Paul knew that solving the Croatian question was not just a matter of justice or fairness, it was a matter of national security. He had to unify his house before the hurricane hit. By the summer of 1939, with war in Europe looking not just possible but imminent, the negotiations reached a fever pitch. Paul knew time was running out. He summoned the Prime Minister, Dragiša Kvetković, a more moderate Serbian politician, and gave him a clear mandate: go to Zagreb, meet with Maček, and do not come back without a deal, whatever it takes. The result, hammered out after weeks of intense last-minute bargaining, was the Sporazum, or agreement, of August 26, 1939. It was a landmark achievement, a revolutionary moment in Yugoslav history. It created a large autonomous Croatian province, the Banovina of Croatia, which incorporated most of the historic Croatian lands and had a significant degree of self-government. It would have its own assembly, or Sabor, and its own governor, or ban. In return, Maček and his party agreed to end their opposition and enter the central Yugoslav government. For Paul, this was the crowning achievement of his regency. He had done what everyone said was impossible. He had solved the Croatian question through peaceful compromise. He had, he believed, finally laid the foundations for a stable, unified Yugoslav state. He had averted a civil war and strengthened the country just as the world was about to descend into chaos. But his triumph was tragically short-lived. The ink on the Sporazum was barely dry when the news came from Germany. 1 week after the agreement was signed, on September 1, 1939, Hitler's armies invaded Poland. The Second World War had begun. The hurricane Paul had been racing against had finally made landfall. For a brief, shining moment, it seemed as though the pragmatist had won. By forcing through the Sporazum, Prince Paul had achieved what many thought impossible: a peaceful settlement to the Croatian question. His overarching goal had always been a desperate holding action, to preserve Yugoslavia's independence and territorial integrity until his nephew, King Peter II, was old enough to rule. But this monumental act of internal statesmanship was granted only 1 week of peace. The German invasion of Poland and the subsequent outbreak of the Second World War upended his world, instantly overshadowing his domestic triumph with a continental catastrophe. The challenge was no longer one of internal compromise, but of international survival, and his tightrope walk was about to become infinitely more perilous. He immediately declared Yugoslavia's strict neutrality. It was the only logical course. The country was militarily unprepared for a major conflict, ethnically divided and economically vulnerable. To join either side would be to invite invasion from the other. Neutrality was not a moral stance, it was a strategy for survival. For the first few months of the conflict, during the period known as the Phony War, this strategy seemed viable. The Western Front was quiet and the war felt distant, a conflict of nerves rather than of armies. Paul clung to the hope that a diplomatic solution might yet be found, that the madness would pass. He tried to perform a delicate, exhausting balancing act. He assured the British and French ambassadors of his personal sympathies, of his unwavering belief in their cause. He was, after all, a friend and a cousin to the British king. At the same time, he had to maintain correct, if cool, relations with Germany and Italy, who were now his most powerful and dangerous neighbors. Germany was Yugoslavia's single largest trading partner, a source of vital industrial goods and a market for its agricultural products. He could not afford to antagonize Berlin. He was walking a diplomatic tightrope over a chasm, and the rope was fraying fast. He was also painfully aware of the divisions within his own government and military. The Serbian officer corps, fiercely nationalistic and viscerally anti-German, was overwhelmingly pro-Allied. They remembered the Great War, when they had fought and died alongside the French and British. For them, neutrality felt like a betrayal. They listened to Churchill's defiant speeches on the BBC and yearned to join the fight. On the other hand, many Croats and Slovenes, having lived for centuries under Austrian rule, felt no such loyalty to the Allies. Their primary concern was avoiding being dragged into what they saw as another one of Serbia's wars. Paul knew that if he declared war, his own army might fracture along ethnic lines before it ever faced the enemy. The pressure was relentless. The British and French wanted him to lean their way, to cut off strategic mineral exports to Germany. The Germans and Italians wanted the opposite, demanding greater economic cooperation and a clear alignment with the Axis. His days were a ceaseless round of tense meetings with ambassadors, ministers, and generals, each pulling him in a different direction. His nights were sleepless, filled with worry. He wrote to the Duke of Kent of the immense strain, of feeling like he was living on the edge of a volcano. He felt the crushing weight of 20 million lives on his shoulders, and he was desperately alone. In the spring of 1940, the volcano erupted. The phony war ended, and Hitler's blitzkrieg was unleashed upon an unsuspecting Europe. In April, German forces invaded and conquered Denmark and Norway in a matter of weeks. On May 10th, they struck west. The Wehrmacht smashed through the Netherlands, Belgium, and Luxembourg. They bypassed the supposedly impregnable Maginot Line and poured into France. The French army, considered the most powerful in the world, collapsed in a stunningly short campaign. For Prince Paul, the fall of France in June 1940 was not just a distant news story. It was an earth-shattering event, the cornerstone of his entire strategic world crumbling into dust. Yugoslavia's entire defense doctrine, its alliances, its very reason for being, had been built on the foundation of a strong France. France was its great power patron, its military protector, the counterweight to German and Italian ambitions in the region. And now, in the space of 6 weeks, France was gone. The psychological impact cannot be overstated. It was a moment of profound and terrifying isolation. Britain now stood alone, fighting for its very survival during the Battle of Britain. It was a heroic stand, but Britain was a distant naval power. It could offer sympathy, encouragement, and secret agents, but it could not land an army in the Balkans to defend Yugoslavia. Geographically, Yugoslavia was now an island in a Nazi-controlled sea. Hitler was the undisputed master of the continent, and his gaze and that of his ally Mussolini now turned inexorably towards the Balkans. The region was strategically vital. It held key resources, most notably the Romanian oil fields at Ploiești, which were essential to fuel the German war machine. More importantly, Hitler was already planning his next great gamble, the invasion of the Soviet Union. To do that, he needed to secure his southern flank. He could not have a hostile or unpredictable Balkan peninsula at his back when he launched his armies eastward. He needed stability. He needed compliance. The process of vassalization began, methodical and relentless. In August 1940, under German pressure, Romania was forced to cede territory to Hungary and Bulgaria. Soon after, both Hungary and Romania formally joined the Tripartite Pact, the military alliance of Germany, Italy, and Japan. In November, Slovakia joined. The noose around Yugoslavia was tightening. Then Mussolini, eager to prove his military prowess and claim his own sphere of influence, launched a disastrous invasion of Greece from Albania in October 1940. The Greek army, against all expectations, fought back ferociously and humiliated the Italians, pushing them back deep into Albania. This infuriated Hitler. His bumbling ally had not only failed, but had also created a strategic mess. The British had now landed troops in Greece to support their new ally, creating a potential Allied foothold in the Balkans that Hitler could not tolerate. He made the decision. The Wehrmacht would have to intervene. They would crush Greece and secure the region once and for all. And to get to Greece, his armies would need to pass through the Balkans. This brought the crisis to Paul's doorstep. Bulgaria, seeing which way the wind was blowing and hoping for territorial rewards, officially joined the Tripartite Pact on March 1st, 1941. Yugoslavia was now completely encircled by Axis powers, or their allies. There was no escape. The final demand from Berlin was now only a matter of time. The summons came in early March. Hitler requested Prince Paul's presence for a secret meeting at his mountain lair in Berchtesgaden. For Paul, this was the moment he had dreaded for years. He knew he could not refuse. To do so would be taken as an act of defiance, an invitation for invasion. He traveled by train, incognito, his mind racing, rehearsing his arguments, knowing he was about to face the most powerful and dangerous man in the world. The meeting on March 4th, 1941, was a masterclass in Hitler's psychological manipulation. He could be a screaming madman, but he could also be disarmingly charming when it suited him. He greeted Paul with courtesy and respect, treating him as an equal. He spoke not of conquest, but of partnership, of Germany's desire for a peaceful and stable Balkans. He explained calmly and rationally his strategic predicament regarding Greece. He assured Paul that he had no hostile intentions towards Yugoslavia. He did not want to occupy it. He simply wanted it to formally align itself with his new order. He then laid out his offer. If Yugoslavia would sign the Tripartite Pact, Germany would make a series of extraordinary concessions, unlike those offered to any other nation. First, Germany would explicitly and publicly guarantee the sovereignty and territorial integrity of Yugoslavia. This was a direct promise to protect Yugoslavia from the predatory ambitions of its neighbors, Italy, Hungary, and Bulgaria, who were all Axis members themselves. Second, during the signing, Germany would issue a formal note stating that it would not request military assistance from Yugoslavia. This meant no Yugoslav troops would ever have to fight for the Axis. Third, and most crucially, Germany would not demand the right for its troops to transit through Yugoslav territory. The German armies heading to Greece would go around through Bulgaria and Hungary. For Paul, listening to this, it must have seemed too good to be true. It was a deal with the devil, but the terms were astonishingly lenient. Hitler was asking for a signature on a piece of paper, a symbolic gesture of alignment. In return, he was offering everything Paul wanted: peace, security, and the preservation of his country. The pact, as presented, was essentially a non-aggression treaty disguised as a military alliance. It was a way out, a way to keep his country out of the fire, to save hundreds of thousands of lives, to ride out the storm until perhaps the tide of the war turned. Hitler then subtly unveiled the alternative. He spoke of the terrible power of the Wehrmacht, of the fate of Poland, of the utter futility of resistance. He didn't need to shout. The threat was clear, hanging in the pristine mountain air. Join me and you will be safe. Defy me and you will be annihilated. Paul did not commit. He was a diplomat to his core. He thanked Hitler for his understanding and said he would have to consult his government. He returned to Belgrade with a heavy heart, but also with a sense of grim relief. He had been offered a path to survival, a terrible, shameful path, but a path nonetheless. Now he had to convince his own people to walk it with him. The cabinet meetings that followed were agonizing. The Prime Minister, Cvetković, and the Foreign Minister, Sincar Marković, agreed with Paul. They were pragmatists who saw no other option. But the Serbian ministers were deeply conflicted. Their hearts, their history, their very souls screamed in protest at the thought of an alliance with Germany. The Minister of War, General Petar Pešić, was adamantly opposed, arguing that it would be a betrayal of the army's honor. Paul argued his case with a desperate, cold logic. He laid out the military reality. The Yugoslav army, though large on paper, was a relic of the First World War. It had almost no tanks, no modern anti-aircraft guns, and an air force that would be swept from the sky in hours by the Luftwaffe. It was also, he reminded them, an army of uncertain loyalties, with many Croat soldiers unlikely to fight for a Serb-dominated government. An invasion would not be a glorious battle. It would be a slaughter, followed by a brutal occupation and the dismemberment of the state. He had seen the German intelligence reports. He knew Hitler's plans for partitioning the country among its neighbors. We are faced with a choice between our principles and the survival of our people, he argued. To choose war was to choose national suicide for the sake of honor. His duty as regent, he insisted, was to the living, not to a romanticized ideal of a heroic death. Slowly, reluctantly, he wore them down. 3 Serbian ministers resigned in protest, but the rest of the cabinet, seeing the inescapable logic of his position, finally gave their consent. The decision was made. On March 25, 1941, in the opulent Belvedere Palace in Vienna, a city filled with German uniforms, the Yugoslav Prime Minister Dragiša Cvetković signed the Tripartite Pact. Paul was not there. He remained in Belgrade in his palace, a virtual prisoner of his own decision. He knew how this would look to the world, especially to his friends in Britain, who would see it as a craven act of betrayal. He had just shaken hands with the devil, but he believed with every fiber of his being that he had made a devil's bargain to save his nation. He had no idea that in trying to save it, he had just lit the fuse for its destruction. Returning from Berchtesgaden, Prince Paul carried the heavy weight of his decision. He had looked into the abyss and chosen a path of profound dishonor, believing it was the only way to spare his people from the horrors of a war they could not possibly win. His choice was a product of cold, grim logic, but he had made a fatal miscalculation, not of the German army's strength, but of the soul of his own Serbian people. What is logical in a palace can be treasonous in the street. As the news of his devil's bargain reached Belgrade, the abstract calculations of geopolitics collided with that raw, passionate soul. The pact he signed to ensure peace would instead become the very spark that would ignite the flames of war. The news of the signing in Vienna did not leak out. It exploded. When the official announcements were made, a wave of disbelief swept through the streets of Belgrade, followed by a tidal wave of pure, unadulterated rage. For the Serbian people, this was not a pragmatic act of statecraft. This was a profound, almost spiritual betrayal. Their national identity had been forged over 5 centuries of resistance to the Ottoman Empire, culminating in the heroic, bloody struggle for independence in the 19th century. Their defining myth was the Battle of Kosovo in 1389, a catastrophic military defeat that was culturally transformed into a moral victory, a choice to die with honor rather than live under subjugation. This ethos was burned into their collective consciousness. To ally with Germany, the nation that had been their primary enemy in the Great War, the war in which Serbia had sacrificed a quarter of its population, was unthinkable. To do so without a shot being fired was a national humiliation of the highest order. It felt like the entire history of Serbian sacrifice, from Kosovo to the Salonika front, had been rendered meaningless. The streets of the capital and cities across Serbia began to fill with spontaneous protests. University students walked out of their classes. Patriarch Gavrilo, the head of the powerful Serbian Orthodox Church, delivered a thundering sermon denouncing the pact as a betrayal of God and nation. The crowd swelled, and a slogan began to ripple through them, a cry from the very heart of the Serbian identity. Better a grave than a slave, bolje rat nego pact. Better the grave than a slave, better a war than the pact. It was a declaration that national honor was worth dying for, a direct and furious repudiation of Prince Paul's cold, pragmatic logic. He had tried to save their lives, but they were shouting in the streets that they would rather lose them than their souls. This wave of popular fury was the perfect cover for a group of men who had been waiting for just such a moment. They were not driven by emotion alone, but by a combination of professional pride, political conviction, and encouragement from a foreign power. Within the senior ranks of the Royal Yugoslav Air Force, a conspiracy had been simmering for months. The leaders were a group of fiercely pro-Western Serbian nationalist officers. The most senior among them was General Dusan Simovic, the commander of the Air Force. But the operational mastermind, the real engine of the plot, was his deputy, the energetic and determined Brigadier General Bora Mirkovic. These men were soldiers, not diplomats. They viewed the world in stark, unambiguous terms of honor and duty. They had trained with the French, they admired the British, and they viscerally detested the Germans and Italians. They saw Prince Paul's policy of accommodation as a slow, creeping cancer that was rotting the nation's moral fiber. They believed the Regent, with his foreign wife, his English manners, and his effete love of art, was not a true Serb. They suspected his motives and despised his methods. For them, the signing of the tripartite pact was the final unforgivable act of treason. It was the signal to strike. But they were not acting in a vacuum. Their convictions were being actively encouraged and supported by the British. With France defeated, Winston Churchill's government was fighting a desperate, lonely war. They were using every weapon at their disposal, and one of the most effective was the Special Operations Executive, or SOE. The SOE's mission was, in Churchill's famous phrase, to set Europe ablaze. They were masters of espionage, sabotage, and most importantly, political subversion. The British legation in Belgrade had become a hotbed of intrigue. SOE agents working under diplomatic cover had established deep contacts within the Yugoslav military and political circles. They identified the simmering discontent and began to carefully fan the flames. They offered encouragement, strategic advice, and likely financial support, making it clear that a pro-Allied Yugoslavia would have Britain's backing. It was an alignment of interests that proved tragically misleading for the Yugoslavs. For Churchill, the strategic calculation was cold and clear. A coup in Yugoslavia would be a massive propaganda victory. It would show the world, and especially the still neutral United States, that nations were willing to fight and die to resist Hitler. More practically, it would completely disrupt Hitler's timetable in the Balkans. It would create a new unexpected front, forcing him to divert troops and resources to deal with Yugoslavia before he could attack Greece. Any delay to Hitler's Balkan campaign was a delay to his planned invasion of the Soviet Union. The British knew that invasion was coming, and every week they could buy was a strategic victory of immense proportions. The fate of the Yugoslav people in the aftermath of such a coup was a secondary consideration. In the brutal calculus of total war, Yugoslavia was a pawn to be sacrificed to save the king. So as the crowds chanted in the streets, General Mirković and his fellow conspirators finalized their plans. They had the popular anger they needed for cover. They had the moral certainty of their own convictions. And they had the quiet, firm backing of a great power. The stage was set for the last successful military coup in modern Yugoslav history. In the early hours of March 27, 1941, just 2 days after the signing in Vienna, the plotters struck. The operation was swift, efficient, and almost bloodless. Air Force officers loyal to Mirković led small detachments of troops to seize key installations across Belgrade. They took control of the main post office, the telephone exchange, and the radio station. They surrounded the ministries and the royal palace. Another group of officers went to the home of the Prime Minister, Dragiša Cvetković, the man who had signed the pact, and placed him under arrest. Other ministers who had supported the pact were also rounded up. There was virtually no resistance. The Royal Guard, which was supposed to protect the government and the Regent, was caught completely by surprise and offered no opposition, with many of its members sympathetic to the coup's aims. Prince Paul was at the White Palace. He was woken from his sleep and told that tanks were in the streets and that the government had been overthrown. His reaction was not one of panic or anger, but of profound, weary resignation. He had always feared something like this. He knew the depths of Serbian nationalist feeling, and he knew he was distrusted. He made no attempt to rally loyalist forces or to stage a counter-coup. He saw the futility in it. The passions he had tried to contain had finally broken their dam, and he was not going to stand in the way of the flood. He knew it would be a flood of blood. The conspirators needed a symbol, a legitimate source of authority to sanctify their takeover. They found it in the 17-year-old King Peter II. They went to the young king, a boy who was largely a figurehead, and informed him that he was now in charge. They declared his regency council abolished and proclaimed him to have attained his majority. In a pre-written radio address broadcast to the nation later that morning, the boy king, his voice nervous, announced that he was taking sovereign power into his own hands and that a new government of national unity would be formed, headed by General Simović. When the sun rose over Belgrade on the morning of the 27th, the city awoke to discover it had a new government and a new destiny. The news spread like wildfire, and the reaction was ecstatic. The protests of the previous day transformed into a massive, joyous celebration. Huge crowds poured into the city center, waving Yugoslav, British, and French flags. They carried portraits of the young king. They climbed onto the tanks of the coup plotters, cheering the soldiers as national saviors. The slogan, Bolje rat nego pakt, was no longer a cry of protest. It was a roar of triumph. Paul, now effectively under house arrest, watched the celebrations and is famously reported to have remarked to an aide, "Poor people. They do not know what they have in store for them." He reportedly called them children playing with matches. He knew, with a certainty that chilled him to the bone, that their moment of joyous defiance had just doomed them all. The reaction from London was equally jubilant. Winston Churchill was woken with the news. He was ecstatic. It was the first piece of genuinely good news he had received in months. In a speech, he captured the mood of the Allies perfectly, declaring to the world, early this morning, the Yugoslav nation found its soul. But in his mountain headquarters in Germany, another man was woken with the same news, and his reaction was not one of jubilation. It was one of pure volcanic fury. Adolf Hitler felt personally betrayed. He had offered the Yugoslavs an honorable, lenient deal. He had treated their regent with respect, and in return they had thrown his generosity back in his face, publicly humiliating him in front of the entire world. His rage was not just political, it was deeply personal. He saw the Belgrade coup not as an act of Serbian patriotism, but as a British-engineered plot, a direct challenge to his authority. He summoned his generals on the same day, March 27th. Those who were present later described a scene of terrifying, uncontrolled fury. Hitler launched into a tirade, screaming that he would smash Yugoslavia, destroy it, wipe it from the map. There would be no negotiations, no second chances. The country was to be subjected to a campaign of unmerciful harshness. He gave the invasion a name that perfectly reflected his mood: Unternehmen Strafgericht, Operation Punishment. His orders were chillingly precise. The main blow was to fall on the Serbs, who he saw as the ringleaders of the plot, and the first target was to be their capital, Belgrade. The city was to be destroyed by waves of terror bombing from the air, an assault designed not to achieve a military objective, but to kill civilians and crush the spirit of the people who had dared to defy him. The invasion itself was to be a multi-pronged blitzkrieg, striking from Austria, Hungary, Romania, and Bulgaria simultaneously, with the explicit goal of annihilating the Yugoslav army and dismembering the state. The German military machine, which had been preparing for the invasion of Greece, changed direction with breathtaking speed. Plans were redrawn, divisions rerouted. Within hours, the fate of Yugoslavia was sealed, while the crowds in Belgrade were still celebrating, singing and waving flags in a state of patriotic euphoria. The angel of death was already flying towards them. They believed they had chosen honor over slavery. They had no idea they had chosen an apocalypse. And the man who had tried to save them from it, the man who saw it all coming, was now a prisoner. His political life over, his personal tragedy only just beginning. The new government, in a final act of expediency, decided that the former regent was a political liability. They handed him and his family over to the British, the very people who had helped orchestrate his downfall. His long, painful exile was about to begin. As Paul began his long journey into that exile, a prisoner of the very nation he most admired, the people of Belgrade were still basking in the glow of their heroic defiance. Euphoric crowds hailed the boy king, celebrating their choice. War over the pact, the grave over slavery. They believed they had found their nation's soul. But the war they envisioned was a romantic fantasy, a noble struggle like the Great War. They had no comprehension of the new kind of war Hitler waged, a war of total annihilation, swift and merciless. In his headquarters, a furious Führer had already signed their death warrant. The joyous dream of March 27th was about to end, as the punishment he promised was no longer a threat, but a meticulously planned storm about to descend from the skies. The new government, led by General Simovic, was in a state of chaotic indecision. Having overthrown Paul for signing the pact, they now desperately tried to appease Hitler. They sent messages to Berlin assuring the Führer that they would, in fact, honor the pact's terms. It was a pathetically naive gesture. They had committed the one sin Hitler never forgave: public defiance. He was not interested in their diplomatic overtures. He was only interested in their destruction. On the evening of April 5, 1941, the German Foreign Ministry sent a coded message to its legation in Belgrade. It simply read, "All personnel to depart immediately. Burn the archives." In the capital, life went on. The cafes were full. The cinemas were open. The next morning was Palm Sunday. At 6:30 a.m. on Sunday, April 6th, without any declaration of war, the first waves of the Luftwaffe appeared in the clear morning skies over Belgrade. The Simovic government, in a desperate last-minute attempt to spare the population, had declared Belgrade an open city, meaning it was undefended. It made no difference. Hitler's order was explicit. This was Operation Punishment. For 3 days and 3 nights, hundreds of German bombers, flying in relays from bases in Austria and Romania, systematically carpet-bombed the city. This was not a precision attack on military targets. This was a terror bombing, designed to inflict maximum civilian casualties and break the nation's will. They targeted hospitals, schools, residential areas, and cultural institutions like the National Library, which was burned to the ground along with hundreds of thousands of irreplaceable medieval manuscripts and books, an act of cultural murder. The city was torn apart, a smoking, rubble-strewn ruin filled with the dead and dying. The joyful celebrations of March 27th were a fading, bitter memory, replaced by the stench of cordite and death. Everything Prince Paul had feared, everything he had warned his ministers about, had come to pass in the most horrific way imaginable. Simultaneously, the land invasion began. While some Serbian divisions fought bravely, the army as a whole was overwhelmed. Significant defections among some Croat units, who felt no loyalty to the Belgrade government, combined with the army's outdated equipment, poor leadership, and the Wehrmacht's superior blitzkrieg strategy, led to a complete collapse in just 11 days. The young king and the coup government fled the country, abandoning their people to their fate. Yugoslavia was erased from the map, dismembered by Germany, Italy, Hungary, and Bulgaria. A Nazi puppet independent state of Croatia was created, run by the genocidal Ustaše regime, which began a systematic campaign of slaughter against Serbs, Jews, and Roma. The country descended into a brutal, multi-sided civil war, a hell on earth where neighbor killed neighbor, and over 1 million Yugoslavs would die, the vast majority at the hands of their own countrymen. And where was the man who foresaw it all? Prince Paul, now a prisoner, began his own long, painful journey into obscurity. The British, his captors, first took him and his family to Greece. But as the Germans advanced, they had to flee again. They were evacuated to Cairo and from there sent to the place the British reserved for their most inconvenient political prisoners, a place so remote he could cause no trouble, Kenya. In late April 1941, Paul, Olga, and their 3 young children were interned in an isolated villa in Osirian, on the shores of the beautiful Lake Naivasha. It was a gilded cage. The landscape was magnificent, but it was a prison. Their house was surrounded by a wire fence. Their mail was censored. Their movements severely restricted. For Paul, a man of immense culture, who thrived on intellectual conversation and the life of the European mind, the isolation was a form of slow, psychological torture. The irony was almost unbearable. He, the great Anglophile, was now an outcast, shunned by the local British colonial community, who viewed him with suspicion and contempt. They saw him as a collaborator, a pro-Nazi. He was a prisoner of the very people whose culture he had built his life around, condemned for a decision he had made to try and prevent a catastrophe that his captors had helped to unleash. He received news of the slaughter in his homeland in fragments, through censored letters and old news reports. Every story of the Civil War, of the Ustaše massacres, of the struggle between the Chetniks and the partisans, was a knife in his conscience. He was consumed with guilt and a sense of powerlessness. After several years in Kenya, they were moved to Johannesburg, South Africa, where they lived under less restrictive conditions until the war's end. When the war was finally over, there was no home to return to. Yugoslavia had been liberated by Tito's communist partisans. The monarchy was abolished. The new communist regime, by decree in September 1945, declared Prince Paul an enemy of the state and a war criminal. He was banned from ever returning to Yugoslavia, and all his property was confiscated, including his magnificent art collection, which was integrated into the new National Museum. The coup plotters who had overthrown him were hailed as national heroes, while he was officially branded a traitor. The man who had once ruled a kingdom was now stateless, stripped of his fortune, and forever barred from the country of his birth. He and Olga eventually settled in a modest villa in Paris. He lived his final decades in quiet obscurity, a ghost haunting the edges of European society. He rarely spoke publicly about the events of March 1941. He was a proud private man, and he knew that the verdict of history had already been passed. The world celebrated the coup as a glorious act of defiance. No one wanted to hear the inconvenient truth that this glorious act had directly led to a national catastrophe. Prince Paul of Yugoslavia died in Paris in 1976 at the age of 83. He was buried in a cemetery in Lausanne, Switzerland, still in exile, still officially a traitor. So how should history remember Prince Paul? Was he a weak-willed coward who sold his country's honor to appease Hitler? Or was he a clear-eyed pragmatist who made an agonizing choice to save his people from certain annihilation? This is the heart of his controversial legacy, and the arguments are as passionate today as they were in 1941. The case against him is simple and emotionally powerful. At a time when the world was drawing a line between freedom and tyranny, Paul chose to align Yugoslavia with the forces of darkness. His decision to sign the tripartite pact was a profound moral failure. It betrayed the nation's alliance with the Western democracies and stained its honor. The coup, in this view, was a necessary and heroic act. It was the moment Yugoslavia found its soul, as Churchill said. The immense suffering that followed was tragic, but it was the price of freedom and defiance. For proponents of this view, a nation's honor is more important than its survival under subjugation. But there is another side to the story, a more complex and uncomfortable one. The case for Prince Paul is built not on emotion, but on grim reality. He was not a fascist sympathizer. He was an Anglophile who detested everything Nazism stood for. His decision was not born of cowardice, but of a desperate calculation. He looked at the map, he looked at his army, and he saw the truth. Resistance was futile. It would not save Yugoslavia. It would only ensure its complete destruction. He negotiated a pact that, on paper, was remarkably favorable. It kept German troops out, it kept Yugoslavia out of the war, and it preserved the state. He wasn't choosing tyranny, he was choosing survival. His defenders ask a simple, haunting question. What would have happened if the coup had failed? Yugoslavia would have sat out the war, its people spared, its infrastructure intact. The men who overthrew him are celebrated as heroes, but they were the architects of their own country's destruction. Paul was condemned as a traitor, but his plan was the only one that might have saved it. There's also the controversial role of the British. It's now well documented that the British SOE actively funded and encouraged the coup. For Churchill, it was a strategic masterstroke. It delayed Hitler's invasion of the Soviet Union by several crucial weeks, perhaps altering the course of the war. But that sacrifice was made by the Yugoslav people, not by the men in Whitehall. For Britain, it was a geopolitical victory. For Yugoslavia, it was an apocalypse. Paul was a pawn sacrificed in a much larger game. The consequences of those days in March 1941 echoed for decades. The Civil War brought Tito's communists to power, who forged a second Yugoslavia held together by his iron will. Under Tito, Paul was officially erased from history, his name synonymous with treason. The official narrative was simple. The brave people had risen up against a treacherous regent. There was no room for nuance. But after Tito's death and after Yugoslavia disintegrated once more in the brutal wars of the 1990s, people in Serbia began to look at their own history differently. A new generation began to question the old certainties. In 2011, a Serbian high court officially rehabilitated Prince Paul. The verdict found that he had been the victim of a politically motivated show trial by the communist regime, and that he had not been a traitor. It was a stunning reversal, an admission that the man condemned for nearly 70 years may have been right all along. The final chapter of his long journey came a year later in 2012. The remains of Prince Paul, his wife Olga, and their son Nikola were exhumed from their graves in Switzerland. They were flown to Belgrade. At the airport, their coffins, draped in the old royal Serbian flag, were met by an honor guard and members of their family. They were then taken to Oplenak, the traditional burial place of the Karađorđević dynasty, and laid to rest alongside the ancestors and the king he had once served. The exile was finally over. The regent had come home. The story of Prince Paul is not a comfortable one. It offers no easy heroes or villains. It forces us to live in the gray ambiguity of history, where good intentions can lead to disaster and pragmatic choices can look like moral cowardice. He was a man of the 19th century, a believer in reason, culture, and compromise, who was confronted by the brutal ideological certainty of the 20th. His greatest sin, perhaps, was that he was too civilized for the times he lived in. His life is a profound and tragic lesson. It reminds us that history is not always a choice between right and wrong, but often between one bad option and another that is infinitely worse. He made a choice to save the lives of his people, and in return he lost his country, his reputation, and his home. He was a man who wanted only to build a museum, but was forced to preside over the demolition of a nation. In the end, his quiet, posthumous return to the soil of his homeland is not a victory, but a quiet acknowledgement of a tragedy so immense it took a lifetime to unfold, and even longer to understand.